So as you can tell, I quite enjoyed Men, Women, and Chainsaws. You know, despite it being nearly 30 years old, it's not quite as dated as you would expect it to be. Like, I own essay collections published in the last 10 years that have aged much worse than this has. So because I'm a nerd and because this entire video is going to hinge on depictions of female characters, femaleness, and the inherent difference between genders, if there is any, we are going to take one of Carol Clover's quotes and use it as a bit of a guardrail for analysis. Boys die, in short, not because they are boys, but because they make mistakes. Some girls die for the same mistakes. Others, however, and always the main ones, die because they are female. The more concerned a given film is with that condition, the more likely the femaleness of the victim. It is no accident that male victims in slasher films are killed swiftly or off-screen, and that prolonged struggles inevitably figure females. Abject terror, in short, is gendered feminine. To date, there are 3 Black Christmas films. No sequels, interestingly enough, just the original film and 2 remakes, released in 2006 and 2019. And boy, would you believe that I'm the first person to have opinions on these? Well, usually when people have opinions on these films, it is that the original film is good and the remakes are bad, and that it is funny that Bob Clark made 2 of the most defining Christmas films just 10 years apart. And yes, the juxtaposition between Clark's Christmas films is funny. But as you may remember from my previous videos, I have credentials as Guy, who is really annoying about depictions of gender in horror. And all 3 of these Black Christmases engage with feminism and feminist themes on a spectrum of intentionality. They all pull and poke at these threads that I've seen mirrored in other horror films, and I almost never see them discussed. Not in the way that I find them and these films interesting, at least. So let's talk about it. Specifically, let us first talk about gender essentialism. Alright, so before we can get into the fun movie stuff, I have to be a gender studies professor. For the sake of clarity, what is gender essentialism? Gender essentialism, otherwise known as bioessentialism, is a theory that assumes men and women are inherently different due to their biology. It asserts that whole people, or individual traits, are inherent and unchangeably masculine or feminine. It is slightly similar to the one-sex theory, which presented this idea that while there are perhaps many genders, there is only the male sex, assuming that women are just men with misplaced or internalized parts. But that theory was more concerned with, like, medicinal practices, while gender essentialism is a little more abstract, focusing on traits and expression as well as biology. Men are naturally stronger, women be shopping, stuff like that. This ideology is obviously flawed on a number of levels, which we will deconstruct and examine throughout the course of this video, but its number one flaw, at least in my eyes, is its assumption of rigid binaries. First, sex is not the same thing as gender. Your genitals do not determine whether you present masculine or feminine. And even your gender identity does not determine how you present, or else we wouldn't have masculine trans women and effeminate trans men. Sex, gender, and gender expression all exist on a spectrum. They are reliant on a multitude of factors, both external and internal. That being said, nuance does not translate into Hollywood very well. The idea that boys will be boys and girls will be girls has proven pretty hard to shake, even as the 21st century has admittedly seen a lot more outright challenges of what it means to be a man, woman, or anywhere else on the spectrum of gender. Despite it being disproved decades ago, the theory of gender essentialism is still common to see used, both in fictional and non-fictional settings. For Vox, Emily James writes, "We know intuitively that not all men are oppressive and not all women are nurturing, even if the patriarchal structures we exist within might say otherwise. Thus, cultural feminism is on the wane within larger feminist theory. However, a story where one group of people is inherently bad and another inherently good is a great place from which to tell stories. Thus, people who write fiction of all sorts keep going to this well again and again and again, simply because it offers feel-good pop feminism and a way to comment on the issues of the day without having to really delve into them. In many ways, Don't Worry Darling and Barbarian are in conversation about the same idea. Men are monsters, perhaps on some deep essential level. In neither film does a man become a literal monster. In both films, men are just awful because they build systems that oppress women. Literally in both cases, as it turns out. They can't help it. It's just who they are." In total honesty, I believe that gender essentialist ideology in art is more neutral than inherently negative. Is it reductive? Absolutely, but I'm a writer. I understand the need to use shorthand and stereotypes to communicate a point, or to eventually try to subvert reader expectations. It's just another aspect of storytelling that audiences should be conscious of and be able to identify. Films like The Silence of the Lambs, Jennifer's Body, The Love Witch, and yes, even Barbarian, all use gender essentialist rhetoric in order to communicate points about gender, both positive and negative, intentionally and unintentionally. There are plenty of horror films that exploit these seeming inherent differences between men and women, and the scares that can arise from this disconnect. BTW, Anna Byler's Love Witch is a great example of a hashtag girl power narrative that shoots so hard into gender essentialist rhetoric that it becomes an unintentionally hilarious wet blob of transmisogynistic mush. Seriously, Google this woman, this is incredibly in character for her. But when we talk about Black Christmas and its depictions of gender, I don't mean to imply negativity every time that I invoke gender essentialism. And I think it would be disingenuous to assume the same level of intentionality with every single small detail or theme that could be construed as feminist or conversely anti-feminist. Like, as a random, non-topical example, it is a pretty bad faith interpretation of The Exorcist to imply that Chris McNeil wasn't present in the climax of the original film because of the patriarchy. Some stuff just isn't that deep, you know?
My opinion is because I'm not a member of the damn patriarchy.
Anyway, the 2019 version of Black Christmas is probably the version that engages with gender essentialist rhetoric the most overtly and infuriatingly, but each version is uniquely defined by the way in which it utilizes feminist themes and essentialist ideology. And now we finally get to talk about it. Now, I'm assuming that if you're watching this video, you have some inkling of at least one of these Black Christmases. I am still going to do my best to recount each film as straightforwardly as possible, and there will be spoilers, you have been warned. Black Christmas follows the sorority sisters of Pi Kappa Sigma. The girls, including but not limited to Jess, Barb, and Phil, have been getting harassed by the same obscene phone caller for some time. At the start of the film, Barb tells him to fuck off, which upsets Claire, who goes upstairs and gets strangled by an unseen figure, who then stuffs her in the attic and turns her into the poster art. The next morning, our protagonist Jess tells her boyfriend Peter that she is pregnant, but that she's also getting an abortion, and it's more of a statement than an invitation for a debate. Meanwhile, some of the other girls and Claire's boyfriend report her missing to the police, while a local high school girl is being reported missing at the same station. Back at the house, the killer murders the house mother, a giant search party forms to look for Claire and the missing high school girl, which ends up finding the latter's brutalized body in the park. Jess is alone at the house until Peter shows up to try and talk her out of the abortion again, but she's not budging, and he has an unfortunately serial killer-esque meltdown right as the cops show up to bug the house's phone lines, since they've put together that between the murdered girl and the still missing Claire, they might want to take the prank caller seriously. Barb gets killed off while Jess attempts to keep the creepy guy on the phone long enough for the cops to track his location. During these sequences, the killer refers to himself as Billy and refers to someone named Agnes, although it's not clear who Agnes is and if the killer is actually named Billy. The most we ever see of the guy is his eye, and in the confines of this film, there is no backstory for him. Phil then gets murdered off screen right before the cops are finally able to trace the call and deliver the classic,
"The caller is in the house. The calls are coming from the house."
Jess goes upstairs to try and find Phil, ends up seeing that eyeball in the dark, and barely manages to escape him in the basement. Peter, patron saint of bad timing, forces his way into the basement not long after, which naturally results in Jess clubbing the ever-loving shit out of him until he dies off screen. The cops show up, surmise that Peter must have been the killer all along, and leave a sleeping Jess in the house in order to take Claire's dad to the hospital. The final shot of the film reveals that not only have the bodies in the attic remained undiscovered, but a ringing phone indicates that the real killer is still inside. Black Christmas is the most 2006 movie ever made. It's Christmas Eve at Delta Alpha Kappa, which was the scene of a brutal series of murders 15 years prior. Billy Lentz was born in that house, a severely abused young boy who suffered from jaundice so intense that he closed like a softball. His evil mother has her husband killed, locks Billy in the attic, and eventually rapes him in order to conceive, well, I can't say a normal incest baby, but an incest baby that does not also function as a glow stick. This is Agnes, we'll get to her later. Eventually, Billy murders his mother, her trashy boyfriend, and rips out Agnes's eye. The cops arrest Billy and lock him in a mental institution while Agnes is sent off to an orphanage. Back in the present day, our girls, including but not limited to Kelly, Melissa, Heather, Dana, and Claire, are getting ready for Christmas break, which includes a secret Santa ceremony where one girl is always picked to give a ceremonial gift to Billy. Claire is once again our opening kill and is put in the attic for safekeeping, quickly joined by another sister, Megan. Megan had also been fucking Kelly's boyfriend Kyle and is introduced with her watching their sex tape on her laptop. This plot thread goes nowhere and is stupid. Heather eventually admits that she drew Billy's name and didn't buy him any present, which results in our house mother, Mrs. Mack, played by Phil's actress Andrea Martin, giving us the Billy backstory that I just rushed us through. At the same time, Billy murders his way out of the mental institution, and the girls start to get obscene, unsettling phone calls, which seem to come from the cell phones of the missing sisters. Claire's half-sister Lee shows up to look for Claire, who failed to meet up with her earlier. Kelly's boyfriend Kyle also shows up, but the girls force him out of the house once they find the sex tape that I mentioned earlier, and also because he gets suddenly and intensely antagonistic toward them without warning. The power cuts out, which leads to Dana getting murdered. The girls finally realize that there's a serial killing happening and discover another girl's body out in her car. Her name was Eve. There's a brief red herring moment where the film implies she might be Agnes because she's ugly and weird and shot from a low angle, but she's only here to be a fun little head prop. Everybody runs back inside where they split up. Kelly, Melissa, and Lee opt to wait for the cops together while Mrs. Mack and Heather try to flee to the car, and they both get immediately murdered. Melissa dies here too, followed quickly by the Barb equivalent Lauren. Finally, the film reveals that our characters have not just been fighting off one killer, but two. There's Billy, of course, but also Agnes, whom the film tells us had coincidentally recently been let out of her institution. Agnes murders Kyle and then reveals all the bodies she's been keeping in the attic. Lee falls through the floor to safety while Kelly and Agnes have a #girl fight. This leads to the attic being set on fire, and eventually Lee and Kelly escape and leave the murder siblings to burn. Thankfully, we are in the wrong turn, superpowered incest cinematic universe, so while Kelly and Lee recover in a hospital, it turns out that Agnes and Billy are alive downstairs in the morgue. They escape and kill Lee before Kelly kills Agnes with a defibrillator, and eventually manages to impale Billy on top of a Christmas tree, which finally kills him. Black Christmas 2019. College student Lindsay is attacked and killed by a masked individual right before Christmas break starts. Roll credits. Riley Stone is a member of Mu Kappa Epsilon and has been struggling with PTSD after being raped by Brian Huntley, the former president of Delta Kappa Omicron, 3 years earlier. Her best friend Chris has recently successfully petitioned to move the bust of the university's founder, Calvin Hawthorne, out of the main campus building and is now attempting to get Carrie Elwes fired because he doesn't teach books written by women. I know he has a real character name, I just refuse to acknowledge it. Riley also has two other friends, Marty and Jesse. They're sweet. Riley and company show up to a talent show being put on by Delta, where Riley secretly watches a bunch of dudes in robes perform a strange initiation ceremony with the bust of Calvin Hawthorne and then says nothing about it. No big deal, weird black goo? Sure. Then she saves her best friend Helena from being sexually assaulted, and because Helena is too drunk to perform, Riley ends up taking her place in the talent show, which is a musical parody of Up on the Housetop, specifically about Delta protecting rapists and about Riley's rape in particular. Also, Brian is at the party, he just kind of stands there in the corner and looks smug. They leave the party after that, and Riley starts up this kind of flirtationship with this guy Landon. He is the geeky and only non-white guy the film has to offer us. Meanwhile, Helena goes back to the sorority house and is seemingly killed by the masked guy from the beginning of the film. The next day, the girls start getting threatening texts from a guy pretending to be Calvin Hawthorne. Riley reports these disappearances to the campus police, but he is a man and doesn't take her seriously. She also runs into Carrie Elwes again and sees that he has a list of Mu Kappa girls. Again, nothing suspicious here. Turns out somebody recorded the girls' talent show performance and put it on YouTube, which sparks a fight between Riley and Chris. Chris thinks that this will finally force the frat guys to face some accountability, and Riley argues that she doesn't want to be an activist, and she also points out that this is probably why they've been getting the threatening texts. And then, kind of out of nowhere, Marty's boyfriend starts going on a rant about not all men and basically turning into Brett Kavanaugh, until Marty kicks him out. Jesse goes upstairs and gets killed, and the closest thing to a callback we have to the original film. The remaining three girls are also attacked. Marty's boyfriend shows back up again and gets killed before Riley is able to kill their attacker. Then, two other guys in masks show up and attack them. Marty dies, and Riley figures out, making some giant ass leaps along the way, that the Delta boys have been using the bust of Hawthorne in order to practice black magic and kill all of these girls. Obviously. Chris suggests the police, Riley vetoes that and goes to the frat house by herself. Chris discovers that a bunch of mass attackers have been attacking all of the sorority houses and ends up going from house to house recruiting them. Pin in that. Riley comes across Landon, who helps her get inside the Delta house. The Delta boys immediately absorb Landon into their ranks while Riley sneaks around. She discovers that Helena is still alive, but then gets knocked out. When she wakes up, she is surrounded by the frat guys and Carrie Elwes, and, well... Okay, so... when Chris's petition forced the Hawthorne bust to get moved from the main campus building, the frat ended up taking the bust and discovering that Hawthorne was a black magic wizard who included written instructions for the fraternity to summon the spirit of Hawthorne so that he can possess the bodies of new pledges and murder women because he was a raging misogynist who wanted to keep women, quote, in line. And Helena is like this pick-me tradwife girl who ends up getting killed 5 seconds later. And then Chris shows up with all the rest of the sorority girls, and it turns into like a Marvel film. an action sequence. And Riley tells Chris that she was right about Riley needing to be an activist at the expense of her own personal well-being. And she uses this newfound strength to fight off Brian, and the bus gets smashed. And then Chris sets Carrie Elways on fire, which feels like a metaphor for something. And then the girls in Landing get out of the frat house and watch it burn down, and Riley pulls a Midsummer. Roll credits. Honestly, it's hard for me to pin down what exactly works about the original Black Christmas. What still works almost 50 years after it was made? What makes us keep coming back to it? What makes us attempt to capture that magic again twice now, and by most measures to fail in doing so? There's a lot of back and forth discourse on, quote, message horror movies, like Candyman and Promising Young Woman, and what crosses this line from subtle into smashing you in the head with the movie's socio-political messaging. I wouldn't say that my taste skews for subtle, but the message has to feel like it belongs with the story. I like my Ginger Snaps, where the societal persecution of young girls as they go through puberty into womanhood is filtered through the lens of a werewolf narrative. Ravenous, where uniquely American consumption and self-destruction is paired with a really fun cannibalism story. And while I'm kind of lukewarm on Pearl, I think that X had great themes about sex and violence and how our relationships to our bodies impact our lives. People have claimed, including myself at a few points, that Bob Clark did not intend to make a political horror film. However, for the life of me, I cannot find any interview where he actually claims this, and I find the idea that all this feminist rhetoric is incidental to be really far-fetched. Roe v. Wade was codified in January of 1973, which was about a year before Black Christmas would even be filmed. And this film was technically a Canadian production, but Canada's history of abortion rights is a little less sporadic than the United States'. From 1869 to 1969, abortion was completely illegal, until the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1968/69 made some abortion procedures legal, primarily in situations where the woman's health was in danger, before all criminal restrictions were finally lifted in 1988. I also can't find any information on when Black Christmas was specifically written, but it's reasonable to believe that it was written in or around a very tumultuous time for women's rights, and for reproduction rights in particular, because man is it baked into every major aspect of this film. Most obviously, there is the relationship between Jess and Peter. Now, I kind of feel like a broken record talking about this because it is the aspect of the film that everybody has already pointed out as ahead of its time and more progressive than a lot of films coming out today. And that is all true. Peter is a convincingly written shitty boyfriend, very casually breaking into the sorority house and dismissing the missing Claire so he can attempt to belittle Jess out of an abortion. He frames all of this as Jess's selfish act. Jess wants to abort their baby, while he so selflessly declares that he is leaving the music conservatory and that he and Jess are going to get married.
You're talking about killing a baby as though you were having a wart removed.
Honestly, you kind of question why Jess was dating this nutball to begin with, but that's neither here nor there. Think about the way that abortion was framed in cinema before this. Hell, think about the way that abortion is framed after 1974. There are a lot of movies that are either outright anti-choice or that still attempt to scare the audience using abortion imagery.
He's not a thing. He's part of me, and I'm not giving him to you or anyone else.
What's nice about Black Christmas is that it's so matter-of-fact about it. There's not really any foreshadowing to the fact that Jess is pregnant before she tells Peter, nor is there any indication that she's losing sleep over her decision. After all, she has a serial killer to worry about. Priorities. And Peter loses his shit because even though he claims that Jess can still do whatever she wants, within the confines of them being married, I'll note, there's still no ability to accept her control over her own body, and that's ultimately what gets him killed. There's no scene where Billy murders him or where a cop intervenes. There's no male-on-male violence in this film. Peter can't accept Jess as her own autonomous person, and that is what gets him beaten to death with a poker. He dies because he can't let Jess have her own body. Even outside its discussion of abortion, the film is generally pretty matter-of-fact about gender, and it's not all binary. At the risk of sounding like the worst of your Twitter replies, this is not surface-level pop feminism. This is not woman good, man monster. Obviously, there is the complete ineptitude of the male police force on display here, but they aren't just played up for some lighter scenes in between kills. These cops get people killed because they don't take it seriously that a woman can be in danger, especially a college-aged girl. And, of course, there's Peter. But while the other male characters all display levels of ineptitude, Claire's boyfriend, her father, and John Saxton exist as proof that there are men who are trying to do the right thing. The tragedy is that their efforts are either too little or too late. Male violence and entitlement is the antagonist of the film, and that is different from all literal men being the antagonist. The men are actually pivotal in getting the police to take these situations seriously, which I would say is effective use of one's male privilege. And it's good commentary on how men are believed where women aren't. The violence is targeted against women, though, and the film does not shy away from that. While there are men who are trying, they're still not equipped to understand or stop the violence that Billy is perpetrating. Right down to the final shots of the film, where Claire's father passes out, and everybody rushes him to the hospital and they leave Jess alone. Nobody has even searched the whole house yet. Claire and Mrs. Mack are still up in the attic, but a dude passed out, so everybody clears out to take care of him, and they leave behind Jess, the bodies, and Billy. Even at their best intended, the men of Black Christmas can only be marginally helpful. And even when one violent man is killed, there is always another waiting in the dark, waiting for the chance to start up again. The girls are less of a victim of a specific individual than they are victimized by the larger patriarchal system, a faceless, unknowable entity.
But ho, 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 I didn't know. Ho, 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 I didn't know.
Conspiracy theory time. I think they originally wanted a trans killer for this remake. Exhibit 1, the jaundice thing, makes no sense. I refuse to believe that this was anybody's first idea when posed with the task of creating a new, equally memorable Billy. I cannot find any proof of this, but I feel it in my gut. Exhibit 2, Billy's mother. She is like if somebody took Mrs. Bates and just dropped her in the middle of like a Rob Zombie movie. She would fit right in with the misandrous mothers I've seen in Deadly Blessing and Unhinged. Swap hates her kid for being yellow with hates her kid for being a boy, and it still works. This is a mom who literally locks away her shameful male kid and instead focuses on raising a more ideal girl, all while the ugly truth about how she got that child remains ever present above her head. I can read trans text into this film, watch me. And Exhibit 3, the big one, Agnes.
It was just Billy. And then I think Kristen said Billy should be Agnes. It was kind of psycho-ish that Agnes had taken on Billy's identity.
Agnes is a cisgender female character played by a male actor, Dean Frizz.
I think we started clowning around about Dean playing the killer. And that was probably when it was just Billy. And then when Agnes came in, you go, well, yeah, that remains interesting.
Everyone should be home for Christmas.
I would not say that this specific portrayal of a cis character's freakishness or otherness being communicated through casting an actor of the opposite gender is common, but it isn't unheard of. Barbarian also cast a male actor as a female character in order to communicate a sense of otherness. The original Pet Sematary has a male actor in drag for the role of Zelda. Doug Jones and Javier Botet are both actors who have specialized in playing ghostly figures, which has occasionally included the ghost of a female character in films like Crimson Peak, Mama, It Chapter 2, and the original Wreck. And we can even put our own Ted Raimi in here from Evil Dead 2. And this bumps up against trans horror because when you have a tendency to throw men into drag for the sake of horrific shorthand, the wires tend to get a little crossed. I threw out a call on Twitter a while ago to help me find more films where, quote, creepy women are played by men in drag and horror, and not only do I have Robin talking about how Google kept bringing up Insidious Chapter 2, but I had somebody else recommend Ms. Leslie's Dolls. And this isn't condemnation to that guy, by the way, but those are both two films with trans characters. But you see where the confusion starts. Does this character scare me because they're murderous and scary, or do they scare me because I can recognize that they're being played by a male actor in drag, and everything about film history up to this point indicates that that is something to be scary? Thankfully, for our purposes, the screenplay for this film is available online. A first true look at the face of the figure, albeit in the eerie flickering amber light, reveals an unnerving androgyny. Although the face is large and somewhat masculine, the lips and nose are feminine. Agnes is a super-powered incest baby with one eye, whose brother is a glow stick and who can climb the walls like Spider-Man. You did not need to cast a male actor in order to communicate her freakishness or her general otherness. But that's what they did. And this wasn't the casting director getting a wild hair up his ass either. This was written into the script. Agnes's gender presentation was always a pivotal part of her character. There was always this intention to capitalize on transmisogyny with her. The introduction of Agnes as a literal character, and by extension, Agnes and Billy's mother, also creates this interesting new women-blaming film. See, Billy isn't just murderous for no reason, it's because his mother was an emotionally and sexually abusive hag who sat around smoking cigarettes and talking about how Santa got shot down by the Russians. It's Agnes who awakens Billy's true murderous tendencies, and so it's Agnes who is the first victim of his rage. The decision to go more into Billy's backstory also eliminates the mystery of the original film. Part of the metaphor of Billy is that he could be any man. Women really never know which men are safe and which ones are the ones who are going to stab them to death. But you know what? Fine. Black Christmas 2006 did not need to also be a mystery. A straightforward slasher with a clear antagonist is also fine, but in eliminating this mystery aspect, our protagonist having a dirtbag boyfriend is suddenly much less impactful. The fact that he's cheating on Kelly only seems to serve him getting temporarily kicked out of the house. We as the audience know that Billy has escaped the institution. Furthermore, we know that Billy is literally highlighter yellow. Kyle is just some asshole who shows up to get his neck broken by Agnes. There is barely a narrative purpose to his character anymore, and now really no thematic purpose either. He's just here because the original film also had a shitty boyfriend. But where Peter was like symbolic of anti-abortion rhetoric and the desire for men to have control over women, Kyle is not any of those things. The second girl he's sleeping with, Megan, is the second girl to die, so there's never any confrontation between these two characters. It is just simply here to pad the runtime. That being said, and while it is not as cohesive as the original film is, I do like how the sorority sisters still have this sense of community. Like, yes, they're all a lot more cruel and cynical because it's 2006 and we're an edgy, grimdark remake, but there is still a sense that these girls do on some level care about each other. I also really like giving Claire an older half-sister instead of a father who comes looking for her. Lee's relationship with Claire feels like what the movie wanted to be about, these sisters who are trying to get along and have a relationship, but who are kept apart by male violence. Even though both sisters end up getting killed, Lee does get that moment of connection with Kelly in the hospital, and that's nice. But you can see where the feminist themes of the original have gotten cut or rearranged for this version. Instead of this motiveless, faceless killer, we have a definitive male killer who is motivated primarily by his hatred for a woman, and his sister, who is played by a man with the intention of characterizing her as freakish and unnatural. There's no abortion subplot, and very few of the girls have characterization beyond a few expository lines. The male violence is not random or systemic, it is explicitly driven by hatred of an evil female figure. It simultaneously adds more femaleness to the structure of the plot, while at the same time removing other instances of that femaleness and that nuance. And that is how we get to Sophia Takal.
In the frat house, click, click, click. What you guys do here is really sick.
In February of 2019, Blumhouse asked Sophia Takal to write a script and to ultimately have a finished Black Christmas film ready for a release date of December 13th. Takal and co-writer April Wolf's script was greenlit in May, and shooting began that July. To emphasize, they gave Takal 2 months to write a script, and they were shooting in another 2 months. That is 4 months from putting pen to paper for the first time and recording the first line. And granted, there's not a whole lot of solid production information available on this film, but that is still a really short time from writing to filming when compared with both previous iterations. Takal has also stated on multiple occasions that she did not intend to make an anti-man film, and I of course believe her. Despite the vocality and persistence of Turf Frederick, I have to believe that most feminists do not blanketly hate all men. A lot of modern feminists go to great lengths to focus on men, in fact, and the ways that the patriarchy damages all genders. Not all men are created equal. Gay men, men of color, transsexual men, disabled men, and poor men exist within entirely different realities from your cookie-cutter, straight, cis, white Brian. Feminism, in its most basic definition, is the political, economic, personal, and social equality of the sexes. While a common misconception is that feminism indicates a desire to see women as better than men, that is not the case. Ideal feminism strives for total equality, and while this presents equality between the sexes at the forefront, it must also acknowledge race, class, sexuality, as well as gender, which, remember, is different from sex. The addressing of all these factors together is the only way that political, economic, personal, and social equality is conceivably achievable. I am going to play a clip now from Sophia Takal's Black Christmas.
I still don't understand why you want to get him fired so bad.
Because he went totally crazy on me when all I did was ask why his syllabus has no women on it, queer people on it, trans people on it, people of color on it.
Yeah, but...
In case you're curious, this film features no queer characters, no trans characters, and exactly 3 notable characters of color. That is, characters who actually have characters, not just glorified extras. Trust me, there are plenty of Muslim and Black girls in the background of scenes, but there are barely 2 girls who actually have a name and get significant screen time. The problem with making a film this dedicated to the overt discussion of gender is that it is really glaringly obvious when you have omissions. Despite the lack of non-white characters, 2 of Riley's best friends are Black women. Chris's entire character is dedication to social justice, and yet white feminism is never discussed. The impact that a white patriarchy has on both women and men of color is never discussed. There are no trans bodies, so of course trans inclusion in feminism is a non-topic. There is no discussion of any of these girls' financial status, no discussion of any aspect of their identities beyond woman, and that's not feminism. So often in film, feminism is boiled down to meaning female empowerment, and when done right, that is fine. Empowerment can be good and it can be fun. But just throwing some hashtag girlboss glitter onto your movie does not make it inherently feminist. Plenty of feminist horror films have what they think is a feminist concept, and by all accounts on paper it might be, but they only ever manage to pay vague lip service to the idea by way of hashtag girlboss moments and a few throwaway lines about the evils of men. There's never any actual substance to the messaging. To steal a line from some contemporary reviews of Black Christmas, it's t-shirt feminism. We're not actually going to engage with you on the issues between genders. We're just going to affirm gender essentialist ideology that men are inherently bad and that women are inherently good. In this Black Christmas, all men are depicted as violent or are deemed capable of violence for the crime of being male. There's Brian, there's every male involved in the frat, including the pledges. There's evil Carrie Elways, there's the male campus security officer. Marty even makes mention of her parent separation, specifically that her mom is so crazy that it's no wonder her husband left her.
I just don't really feel like dealing with my mom right now. She's just... It doesn't surprise me at all that my dad left her.
The only male character who comes even close to having any humanization is Landon, because he does not pose any overt sexual threat. But even then, the film never examines Landon's place in the patriarchy, nor his seeming exclusion from the other men of his class, be that racial, social, or economic. According to this film, Landon is equally as capable of violence as the literal rapists. Because he's a man, so he's guilty. Alright, are we ready to talk about trans people? So in the Vox article that I quoted earlier, Emily St. James links to another article she wrote about the short-lived TV show Y: The Last Man, a gender apocalypse story adapted from a comic where everybody with a Y chromosome mysteriously dies off. I am completely unfamiliar with both the show and the comic, but she reiterates some good points about how these stories have to do a lot of jumping through hoops in order to deal with trans identity. The problem is that this premise, by its very nature, cannot account for the existence of trans people. Once you start accounting for the existence of trans people, you have to throw binary notions about gender out the window. To be clear, I'm not saying that Y: The Last Man must add transphobia to be realistic. I'm saying that by ignoring the transphobia of our current society entirely, the show is accidentally underlining the gender essentialism of its premise. So there's a scene at the start of Black Christmas where evil Carrie Elways reads a passage about the man's world and how women use men's language to push back against the patriarchy. And then he reveals that the writer was actually a woman, and that you can't always necessarily tell a person's gender by how or what they write about. That writer that he quotes is Camille Paglia. You know Paglia is going to be a fun discussion topic when you see that transgender people is an actual dedicated section of her Wikipedia page. So Camille Paglia is an American academic, social critic, and feminist who teaches at the University of Arts in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She identifies as transgender. That is a sentence that has come out of her mouth, but who Paglia is was very public before 2019 when Black Christmas was written. DeCall said in an interview that both she and Wolf knew who she was and that using her was intentional. But for those of us out of the loop, I am going to quote just one article, one interview from 2017. I condemn the escalating prescription of puberty blockers, whose long-term effects are unknown for children. I regard this practice as a criminal violation of human rights. It is certainly ironic how liberals, who posture as defenders of science when it comes to global warming, a sentimental myth unsupported by evidence, flee all referenced biology when it comes to gender. The cold, biological truth is that sex changes are impossible. Every single cell of the human body remains coded with one's birth gender for life. In a democracy, everyone, no matter how nonconformist or eccentric, should be free from harassment and abuse. But at the same time, no one deserves special rights, protections, or privileges on the basis of their eccentricity.
Give me just half a second. What the fuck?
So, alright, we don't have time to unpack all of that. Totally a woman who defended NAMBLA until like 5 years ago, but I think there is certainly an argument to be made that evil Carrie Elways is using a trans-identified TERF to prove a gotcha in his introductory scene. He's evil, he's a batshit misogynist, and there is commentary to be made here about higher education and gender and transmisogyny. I think that DeCall's intent with invoking Paglia was likely to characterize evil Carrie Elways. The feminists he pulls from is one who is batshit insane and would agree with him on topics like male bashing and sexual assault on college campuses being the fault of women. But the film itself is entirely unconcerned with bodies that are not cis, which is just not lazy, it's actively detrimental to the story, because this is a story of man bad, woman good. They throw Helena in there as an example of women who believe themselves to benefit from the patriarchy, but she is such a non-entity that it is barely worth talking about her. In the end, the film just doubles down on the idea that she is another victim of men, and then we go into the action sequence. And hey, what's that other ideology that asserts that all men are genetically inherently evil and constantly out to terrorize women in any way that they can? It's right on the tip of my tongue. I've heard this one before. For the record, I'm not calling either of these screenwriters TERFs. I have no evidence to back that up. I'm just saying that bad faith use of gender essentialism is a slippery slope that, more often than it doesn't, lands your ass square in the TERF pit, and you do not want to accidentally wind up there. When you have a story where all men are apparently capable of black magic, I think you have to naturally wonder how trans people fit into this world. How does a trans woman engage with these sorority girls? Would a trans guy be subject to possession under these rules? Does the plot just outright explode if you were to try and introduce a non-binary person to it? Either you have to deny trans people their personhood, you have to deem trans women as evil as cis men, and you have to make trans men safe because they're not, quote, real men, or you have to force trans people into binaries that simply do not fit in the real world. By asserting all men to be literally biologically predisposed to violence and cruelty, you have not earned the right to thumb your nose at people like Camille Paglia. For this story to work, all men must be monolithic evil, and that closes the door to so many more interesting stories about gender violence, and the interactions between men and women. Because trans people, I love us, but we are not the same as cis people. Trans women do not move through the world in the same way that cis women do. I do not move through men's spaces the way that cis men do. Regardless of the validity of our identities, that is just a fact. We are not comparable to cis people. A trans man in a world where all men have died is a really compelling figure. But why The Last Man has so far treated Sam with kid gloves? The show wants you to know that trans men are men, ergo Sam is a man, but it also doesn't want to follow the thought experiment of trans men are pretty much the only men left alive to any logical conclusion. It wants to present a world where Y chromosomes march trans women for death, but also everybody suddenly seems psyched about the existence of trans men when we know how unlikely that would be. There are a lot of reasons, in my opinion, that Black Christmas 2019 does not work. But gender essentialism is the main one for me. By asserting that all men are monsters, the film avoids any real examination of the role that men and women play in upholding the patriarchy. It avoids all of the interesting aspects of people that feminism should examine, and instead just focuses on boyness and girlness. Just saying that men are evil is so much more boring than actually exploring how men navigate the patriarchy. And for as much as I did not care for Barbarian, I enjoy what they went with Justin Long's character, who completely convinces himself that he's a good person despite the horrific evil he engages in. And while I deeply dislike the way that this film handled Riley's response to her rape, I can admit the film at least makes an effort to tackle the difficult choices that come with recovering. Chris actively pushes Riley out of her comfort zone and attempts to force her into activism, which results in Riley being subject to more harassment that she is not emotionally capable of handling. And you know, for a moment, it seems like the film might be about to talk about what it means to force all victims to be activists. But then the rest of the film has to happen, and during the #GirlBoss final battle, Riley apologizes to Chris and tells her that she was right.
I'm so sorry! You were right! I should have been fighting this whole time! Now's not really the time for I told you so, but I did tell you so!
And it's doubling down on inherently political messaging like that makes me not balk away from everything else I've discussed here. Because, you know, if you're going to be political, then you cannot just shy away from the shit that complicates the issue. You cannot just dismiss what invalidates your argument like this is paternity leave.
20 million years of evolution. I'm the first man in the history of the world to ever get pregnant. Why?
No, technically, you're the second. Don't forget about Tom Spady.
Except, you know, Greg was actually born a man, so...
I said that gender essentialist is not inherently negative terminology, but I am using it negatively here. Black Christmas acknowledges that things like race, sexuality, and gender exist, but does not ever engage with what that means. It does not treat them as important factors. The men who are not overtly in the constant process of trying to rape somebody are still deemed dangerous. They are inherently dangerous, inherently prone to violence and rape by virtue of being men. Men are inherently one thing, women are inherently something else. It's just biology. In an interview for IndieWire, Sophia Takal stated, "I didn't want to make a movie where men as a monolith are bad people, and I didn't want to make a movie where women as a monolith are good people. There are complexities and nuances in terms of how women see the world. Some people are totally fine with the prescribed roles that you're meant to play, and it felt important to acknowledge that. It felt important to acknowledge that the majority of white women voted for Trump." And I'm just, God, I don't know what cut of the movie she watched. Every single man is bad. Every man is an ineffective asshole besides Landon. The only, quote, evil girl is Helena. One example does not deconstruct a monolith. But monoliths, and by extension binaries, are easy shorthand. They are especially valuable to a screenwriter who only has 4 months to have a script ready for principal photography. So when I say that I believe Sophia Takal when she says that she did not intend to make a film that is anti-man, I'm not being sarcastic. I do believe her. But when you lean this heavily on gender essentialist shorthand, you almost inevitably create monoliths. You establish the reality of each gender to such a definitive degree that it is near impossible to imagine any man in this universe who is not just a hair trigger away from strangling the first girl to walk across his path. Even the men who are only spoken of, who don't even have screen time, are characterized by their negative relationship to women. And so you have a film where I feel almost forced to ask, if men are so unapproachably evil, what is even the point? Let's pivot for a moment. The Snowman is a film that was literally not finished filming before it was duct taped together and released after months of everybody making fun of their adorable little snowman marketing campaign. It is a tragedy of a crime drama. I remember it rather fondly. And at its core, it is a film that tries to be about misogyny. Our killer was formed when his mother drove her car into a frozen lake in front of him, after facing years of physical and presumably sexual abuse at the hands of the boy's father. And naturally, rather than fixating on abusive or absentee fathers, the killer targets mothers he believes to have abandoned or otherwise failed their children. This includes a mother who cheated on her infertile husband in order to conceive her daughter, a would-be mother played by Chloe Sevigny who had aborted her fetus because she didn't know who the father was, and eventually he targets protagonist Harry Hole's former girlfriend, wife, partner, it's not super clear, because for some reason she never tells her teenage son that his dad is Harry Hole. He also kills this doctor who provides abortions, as well as Rebecca Ferguson's character Katrine. In the end, every single female character in this film is defined by the men around them. Katrine isn't just some rambunctious young detective, she is the grieving, sensitive daughter seeking the man who killed her dad and who will go on to kill her as well. Katrine is literally fridge for the sake of Harry Hole's man pain. There's one female character who I don't even think has a name, she just shows up, gets her tits shown to J.K. Simmons, and there's kind of an implication she's being kept prisoner by the abortion doctor, and then she disappears into the realm of, oops, we forgot to film this part of the screenplay, so that's just left completely unresolved. The film isn't uncritical of men, but it never shows them the same violence as it does for its women. Harry Hole is a drunk, absentee father. We see time and time again how he fails his son and how that affects the kid. We are clearly supposed to draw parallels between Harry and the other fathers depicted in the film, and it's meant to comment on the cycle of abuse and abandonment that can fester across generations. When Harry finally tells the killer that his anger should have been directed at his father and not at his mother, that is supposed to be the big thematic message of the whole thing, that women get blamed and punished for the failings of men and that is wrong and bad. But there's no conclusion to this message. Harry Hole saves his son, but there's no moment of reconciliation between the two. We never see the kid again. Harry Hole kills a snowman murderer, and then we immediately cut to him accepting another case, as if he hasn't learned a damn thing, because he probably hasn't. He will probably continue to forget about his kid for the rest of their lives. We never see J.K. Simmons again, so there's no resolution to his presumed abuse of women. The husband of the first victim doesn't see any growth from his misogyny. None of these men grow. They just take their cues from the women around them, whether these women are alive or preferably dead. The Snowman came out in 2017, 2 years before this most recent Black Christmas, but I cannot help but connect the two in my brain. They're both films where I swear I can see some good commentary being possible, films that try and tackle the innate sense of entitlement that some men just have towards women. But whether it's because the film was rushed or just literally wasn't finished, that message gets muddled. It becomes essentialist. All men are sleazy, misogynistic dirtbags. All women are these childlike victims of their own emotions. They have to learn to be activists and stand up for themselves. I mean, the Snowman only sees women actually talking to each other like 2 times over the course of 2 hours. Black Christmas does better in that final point. It passes the Bechdel test, but it asserts very similar binaries. Although Takal insists that she did not intend to make a film that was anti-man, her characters still balk at the idea of male victims in any sense of the term, to the point where she presents a giant conspiracy in which any man can get readily pulled into the fray because all men hate women deep down. All men are monsters. Emily James is right. We know, on some level, that the gender essentialist ideology we see in media is not reality. There are good men, bad women, very complicated trans people, on and on. But at the same time, I am unable to defend things like The Snowman and like Black Christmas because Bob Clark already made a movie that proves you can communicate a lot of these trickier nuances. You can't ever communicate all of them, but you can paint a narrative that does not condescend to an audience. You can communicate that you know enough of what you're talking about that the audience feels less inclined to question you about what you leave unspoken. There are good horror movies about gender, that talk about gender, that do not condescend. They don't need to throw in pop feminism catchphrases and allude to ideology that it refuses to actually engage with. Hell, even wackadoo films like *Malignant* manage to have some fun commentary on the toxicity of family, literal parasitic clingers-on. Because horror is a great genre for tricky themes, horror allows for literalization and externalization in a way that few other genres do. Most horror films today have a literal monster of sadness to overcome, or a literal symbol of oppression, like that bust of Hawthorne, which literally gets destroyed with the destruction of the frat house, with the destruction of this film's patriarchal system. Because she is now literally fighting the patriarchal system, Riley is also able to fight off Brian in the film's climax. The literal symbols are everywhere. Terror is gendered feminine. Note how the only male deaths in the original Black Christmas are off-screen. Hell, note how swiftly the male deaths come in the 2006 version. How quickly the murderous boyfriend dies in comparison to how explicitly and brutally the mother dies. Note that, for all the evils of the fraternity, the male killers are given a death that is off-screen and non-graphic. Even in our most wholly of feminist remakes, we still see more female bodies than identifiably male ones. Each Black Christmas is undeniably concerned with the terror of college-aged girls, but only one presents a narrative without clear answers or resolutions. Only one acknowledges that there is no easy answer or solution to systemic male violence. The original Black Christmas remains effective both as a horror film and as a feminist statement on violence against women. It doesn't cleanly vanquish its killer in the end because that would undermine the message. It doesn't provide rationale or motivation for the violence because it ultimately does not matter. Violence against women happens all the time, and the power structures created and upheld by men do very little to prevent it. Both Glenn Morgan and Sophia Takal play around with these original pieces, and they've created films in which feminist text is still present, but is much more essentialist and binary in its assertions. And that's to say nothing of the transmisogyny present in both textually and subtextually. Transmisogyny on top of a total absence of trans characters, voices who would serve to deepen the narrative about male entitlement and violence, but trans voices complicate that neat gender essentialist message. I mean, you can't make t-shirt feminism when you have to think about how trans people complicate the binary by our mere existences. Gender is complicated, and very stupid. Media has to start reflecting that again.
Up in the frat house, me and you, and we know what I'm there to do. We're drinking and kissing, and what comes next? You and I have sex, but ho, 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 I didn't know. Ho, 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 I didn't know. Up in the frat house, there's one true fact, and that is that I